In the beginning of the parsha, Rashi quotes the words Behar Sinai and explains, Ma inyan Shemitah etzl Har Sinai. Why does it say Shemitah next to Har Sinai? Aren't all mitzvahs given from Sinai, said at Sinai? But we learned that just like Shemitah, all of the general ideas and the details were all said at Sinai, so too, this is true regarding all mitzvahs, that all of the general ideas and the details were given from Sinai. In other words, the fact that by Shemitah it says explicitly that it's by Har Sinai, even though all mitzvahs are by Sinai, it's in order to learn from this regarding all other mitzvahs, that just like Shemitah, all of the details were said in Sinai, so too is true regarding all the rest of the mitzvahs as well, that the general ideas and the details were all given at Sinai. Then Rashi goes on and says, this is what it says in Toras Kohanim. And it seems to me, says Rashi, that this is what it means. Since we don't find Shmitas Karkois, a dinim of Shemitah of land needing to rest, since we don't find it being repeated in Arvui Smoyev, this is when the Yidden are about to enter Eretz Yisrael, in Mishnah Torah, that's in Chumash Dvorim. So since it's not repeated over there, so obviously we learned that all of the details would have been given at Sinai. And the Pasuk is teaching us over here that the same thing is true regarding all the things that Moshe Rabbeinu was told, that everything was given by Sinai along with the general ideas and the details, and were only repeated later in Arvui Smoyev. In other words, what's Rashi coming to tell us? The fact that we know that all the mitzvahs were said at Sinai, that's generally as far as the general idea of the mitzvahs. We know everything was given at Sinai. But we still need to prove that all the details were given at Sinai. So we're learning this out from Shemitah. However, you might say, but the words Behar Sinai might only be telling us regarding Shemitah itself, that the details were said at Sinai. How do we know that this applies also to other mitzvahs? And that's why Rashi says, since the dinim of Shemitah's Karkois are not repeated at all in Mishnah Torah, so from the words Behar Sinai itself, we would have already known that all the details of Shemitah were said at Sinai. So then why does the Torah have to say the words Behar Sinai? In other words, even without Behar Sinai, we would have known that it was said there because it's not repeated later. That's what forces us to say, Boa Kosov, the Pasuk is coming to teach us that it says not regarding Shemitah itself. Shemitah we would have known is from Sinai. Rather, it's coming to teach us about all the other things that Hashem told Moshe that are all coming from Sinai, both the general ideas and the details, and are only being repeated later in Arvui Smoyev. As we understand the Rashi simply, and this is the way the Mefarshei Rashi actually understand it, we understand that Rashi seems to be asking the same question of the Toras Kohanim. Why is the Pasuk by Shemitah need to tell us the words Behar Sinai? And what's Rashi answering according to the Toras Kohanim? That Behar Sinai is coming to tell us that all of the mitzvahs were said at Sinai, both the general ideas and down to the tiniest detail. What's being taught? What are we being taught by this? Because there's another opinion. There's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, and this is what we're negating. Rabbi Yishmael is of the opinion that only the general ideas were said at Sinai, but the details were later said in the Oyel Moed, meaning in the Mishkan. And this is what the Toras Kohanim and Rashi are negating, that we follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that both the general ideas and all the details were said at Sinai. But if this is what Rashi is telling us, we need to understand. Number one, since Rashi's question is that why Har Sinai says by Shemitah, Rashi should have quoted in his Dibur HaMaskal not only the words by Har Sinai, he should have also quoted from the Parsha the words relating to the main question, which is the idea of Shemitah, which is in the next pasuk where it speaks about Shemitah. Rashi should have either quoted those words or at least said V'goymer. His question seemingly is not on the words Behar Sinai. His question is why it's together with Shemitah. So why doesn't he quote the word Shemitah in his Dibur HaMaskal? Another question, if the way we learned that the Chiddush of Rashi is that the details were said at Har Sinai, not in the Mishkan later, as the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael is, if that's the case, then why is he bringing a proof from the fact that we don't find it being repeated in Arvui Smoyev? That's a proof that it was said in Har Sinai. That doesn't prove it was said in Har Sinai. It could have still been said in the Oyel Moed, which is what Rabbi Yishmael says. Again, Rabbi Yishmael says the general ideas were said at Har Sinai. The details were said in the Oyel Moed. What's Rashi proving? From the fact that it doesn't say in Arvui Smoyev, that's a proof to say that it was all said in Har Sinai. Not necessarily Har Sinai. It could have also been said in the Oyel Moed. And therefore, it's not necessarily negating the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. It could still go very well with Rabbi Yishmael. So Rashi should have at least said, we don't find that it was repeated in the Oyel Moyed and in Arvei Smoyev. Then I would have understood that we're not agreeing with Rabbi Shmuel. So too, and Rashi concludes, and he says, and everything was repeated again, that these things were repeated again in Arvei Smoyev. Again, the question was more about whether the details were said in Har Sinai or the Oyel Moyed. Why are we mentioning about the fact that it was repeated in Arvei Smoyev? Rashi should have said its details were repeated again in the Oyel Moyed. That would be according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Yishmael. Also, we need to understand what's the arichos in Rashi's words, v'nira li, and it seems to me that this is the meaning of the words of the Torah's Kohanim, since we don't find it being repeated in Arvei Smoyev, etc. Why is Rashi giving us such an arichos over here, especially that Rashi's Indian is not to come to explain to us pshat in the Torah's Kohanim? So we must say that there is another way of understanding the Torah's Kohanim. And if that would have been the Pirush, Rashi wouldn't have brought the Torah's Kohanim, because then that wouldn't have been helping us in Pshuta Shel Mikra. So Rashi is saying, "V'niruli shekach Pirusha." In other words, it's only according to the way Rashi is understanding the Torah's Kohanim that's going to help us in Pshuta Shel Mikra over here. So we need to understand what is this other Pirush that we could have learned in the Torah's Kohanim, which wouldn't have fit with Pshuta Shel Mikra, which Rashi is coming to negate and to tell us that the Torah's Kohanim means specifically in this particular way. We also need to understand another few diyukim in the wording of Rashi, to mention a few. Number one, Rashi starts off with the words Ma'in Yishmite Eitzel Har Sinai, but then he keeps on using the words in the Rashi, the rest of Rashi just keeps on saying Sinai, Mi Sinai, without the word Har. Number two, when Rashi goes ahead and says Bo HaKosav Limit Kan, the pasuk is over here coming to teach us that every single thing that was said all came from Sinai. Rashi says the words, I'll call Dibur Shenidbar LeMoshe, every single thing that Moshe Rabbeinu, that was spoken to Moshe Rabbeinu. Seemingly, this is just extra words, especially in the Torah's Kohanim, which is the source of where Rashi is coming from, and Rashi is coming to explain, as Rashi himself says, nearly it seems to me this is the meaning. There it just says, Af Kulan, so to all mitzvahs, were said and repeated, but it doesn't say the words Shenidbar LeMoshe that were said to Moshe. Says the Rebbe, the explanation of all of this is Rashi's question over here is actually not, as we thought before, why does Shemitah say together with Har Sinai? Rather, Rashi is bothered by the words Bahar Sinai itself, even before we know which mitzvah we're talking about. The only reason why Rashi is going to bring the question of Torah's Kohanim, Ma'in Yishmita Eitzel Har Sinai, is only because based on the question and answer of the Torah's Kohanim, that automatically is going to help us understand the words Bahar Sinai, of why these words Bahar Sinai are being said over here. What's the problem with the words Bahar Sinai? From the time the Mishkan was set up, everything that Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu was actually not in Har Sinai. It was in the Oyel Moed, in the Mishkan. As Rashi himself had said already, clearly, earlier in Parsha Sicha, that from when the Mishkan was set up, Hashem did not speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, but only from the Oyel Moed. So the question is, how does it make sense that now, after all of these Parshas and Sedres of Seder Vayikra, which started off with the words Vayikra, Hashem calls to Moshe Rabbeinu from the Oyel Moed, and suddenly we're back at Har Sinai. Hashem didn't speak to Moshe Rabbeinu anymore from Har Sinai. Now, B'doichik, we could have tried saying that this is being said out of order. In other words, this was really said earlier before the previous Sedres of Parshas Vayikra and before the setting up of the Mishkan. And the only reason why it says it over here in our Parsha is because we have a concept of Ein Muktum U'Muchar B'Torah. Things are not necessarily written in chronological order. That's the way the Even Ezra actually learns. But the Rebbe says this is very, very not smooth and not easy to learn this way, because this idea of Ein Muktum U'Muchar B'Torah will answer only if there's absolutely no other choice. And even then, we need to have some reason why we would be putting it out of order. But whenever possible, we'll try to understand the Parshas and the Torah in order the way they're written, according to Pshuta Shel Mikra. It's also difficult to answer, as the Ramban answers. In Pshuta Shel Mikra, again, it's going to be a problem to answer this, that Hashem actually spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, yes, earlier in Har Sinai, where he said this Parsha with all of its details. And the Parsha only says over here, right after Parsha Samoir, is because this is when Moshe Rabbeinu was giving over the union of Shemitah with its details, after the story that happens at the end of Parsha Samoir with a certain individual that acted inappropriately, a Ben Isha Yisraelis. Because in the simple, again, wording and order of the psukim, it sounds like Vayidaber Hashem, that this is when Hashem is saying this to Moshe Rabbeinu after the incidents in Parshas Hamoyer. And specifically, according to Rashi, it's very, very difficult to say that Moshe Rabbeinu is giving this over many months after he heard it, because Rashi had already told us earlier an incident where Moshe Rabbeinu was punished for not giving over something immediately. Even though you might try to differentiate and say here is a bit different because here it wasn't so relevant practically yet. Therefore, Rashi learns that Parshas Behar is actually being said right now to Moshe Rabbeinu after the incidents and the end of Parshas Hamoyer with the Ben Isha Yisraelis. So why does it say Behar Sinai? If Hashem didn't speak to Moshe Rabbeinu from Har Sinai anymore, what the Behar Sinai actually means is the Yidden were still standing at the foot of the mountain. This is before the time that Yidden are traveling away from Midbar Sinai and from Har Sinai. This is going to take place much later. This is in Parshas Ba'al Loischa, we're taught that the Yidden travel away. And therefore, even things that are being said to Moshe Rabbeinu, even things that Hashem is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Oyel Moed, in the Mishkan, is still considered Behar Sinai. Especially that we know the whole Midbar is called Midbar Sinai because of the mountain that's there. So again, Rashi is learning that Behar Sinai doesn't mean the mountain, it means the area of Sinai. But since it's a very, very big chiddush to say, Har Sinai means the Oyel Moed, just because it's resting in front of Har Sinai, camping in front of the mountain, therefore Rashi brings the Torah's Koyanim. According to the way Rashi learns the Torah's Koyanim, as Rashi himself says, "V'nirli shekach pirusha," we're going to understand that Behar Sinai must mean Midbar Sinai rather than the mountain itself. Why is that? The Rebbe is now going to examine the Torah's Koyanim. So the Torah's Koyanim said that from the fact that it says Behar Sinai by Shemitah, we learn for all other mitzvahs that the general ideas and the details were all given from Sinai. Now, why is this a proof? Because since Behar Sinai for Shemitah itself wouldn't have been a chiddush, as Rashi explains that even without the words Behar Sinai, we would have known that all the general ideas and the details were given at Sinai, because it's not said later. So we have to say that when it says Behar Sinai over here is not for the purpose of Shemitah, because that we would have seen over here anyways that everything is being given over here. So obviously it's coming to teach us about everything else that Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu. But you might say, why is it so obvious by Shemitah itself that all of them were said at Sinai? So it says the Rebbe, this is going to depend on how we translate the words Behar Sinai. In other words, like this. If we say the words Behar Sinai means the mountain, Behar Sinai means the mountain itself, then of course it has to say Behar Sinai regarding Shemitah, because otherwise we would have not known that the details were said Behar Sinai, because as said before, since this pasuk is written after the establishing of the Mishkan, so I would have thought that the details were given only in the Oyel Moed. So the pasuk Behar Sinai, if it really means the mountain, then it needs to say it for Shemitah, because otherwise I wouldn't have thought it's on the mountain. And the fact that it's not repeated later in Arvei Smoyav is still not a proof that it's on Har Sinai, as said before, because it could have been given in the Oyel Moed. So Behar Sinai would then have to be written for the Shemitah itself. And since Behar Sinai is needed to teach us about Shemitah, so it doesn't teach us anything about any other mitzvahs, that forces us to say that the Torah's Koyanim understands the words Behar Sinai as Midbar Sinai, as the region, as the area of Sinai, in front of Har Sinai. In other words, the fact that the details of Shemitah were said in Midbar Sinai, whether Behar Sinai or Oyel Moed. Now that we would have also known, even if it doesn't say the words Behar Sinai, because Loi Motzinu, we don't find that it should be repeated later. So now we have to say that when it says Behar Sinai, which seemingly we would have known anyways that it means the area of Sinai, it's coming to teach us that all of the other mitzvahs were also said by Sinai, just like Shemitah. But again, Sinai not meaning necessarily Har Sinai, but Midbar Sinai and the area of Sinai. If that's the case, this could be both according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and according to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Because Rabbi Akiva said that everything was said at Har Sinai, both the general idea and the details. Rabbi Yishmael says the general idea was said at Har Sinai, the details of Oyel Moed. But if we understand the word Sinai just meaning that general area, then it could fit with both of them. It's both true. Meaning to say that everything was given at Sinai, both Rabbi Akiva And Rabbi Yishmael would agree with that if we understand Sinai as meaning the general area of Sinai. Says the Rebbe, according to this, that Har Sinai, that means actually Midbar Sinai. So what's the chidush to say that all the general and the details of all the mitzvahs are coming from Sinai? What are we negating? What we're negating, it says Rashi, Arvei Smoyev. In other words, we find certain mitzvahs that are being said in Arvei Smoyev and Mishnah Torah. We may have thought that the details of those mitzvahs were said only in Arvei Smoyev. So we learn from Behar Sinai that says by Shemitah that also those mitzvahs that are being said in Arvei Smoyev are not being said there for the first time. Rather, all of the details were already given at Sinai. And the fact they're being said in Mishnah Torah is only that they're being repeated in Arvei Smoyev. Says the Rebbe, this is what Rashi means when he says, V'nirli shekach pirusha. It seems to me that this is the meaning. He's coming to negate. What he's coming to negate is the other way we could have understood the Torah's Kohanim as that the details are being said the first time in Har Sinai, not in the Oil Moed. Again, many Mefarshim understood the Torah's Kohanim meaning that we're coming to negate the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that Bahar Sinai is to be understood that it's being said everything with its details in Har Sinai. Says Rashi, no, that's not the meaning. We understand the Torah's Kohanim meaning differently. When it says Bahar Sinai, we're coming to negate not the Oil Moed, we're coming to negate Arvei Smoyev, meaning it's all being said in the region of Sinai, but it could still mean the Oil Moed. And as Rashi himself says, that with his Pirush, he's coming to tell us that we don't find that it should be repeated in Arvei Smoyev. And certain things were said in Har Sinai and repeated in Arvei Smoyev, but we're not coming to deal with over here whether it was on the mountain or in Oil Moed. We're not getting involved in that machlokes. Says the Rebbe, now we're going to understand also the diyukim in the expressions of Rashi. First of all, says the Rebbe, the fact that Rashi keeps on saying the word Misinai, doesn't say Mehar Sinai, as the pasuk says Mehar Sinai, Bahar Sinai. What he's coming to emphasize is that according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, all we know is that it was said at the area of Sinai. Now that could be either on the mountain, which would be Rabbi Akiva's opinion, or not on the mountain, but in the Oil Moed, but it's in the region of Sinai, which would be the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Only the first time when Rashi and the Torah's Kohanim as well say Ma'in Yishmita Etzel Har Sinai, because the question Ma'in Yishmita Etzel Har Sinai is on the pasuk that used the words Har Sinai. So Rashi needs to use those words Har Sinai to use the expression of the pasuk. Also says the Rebbe, when Rashi says Uba, cause of the pasuk is telling us called Dibur Shenidbar LeMoshe, that everything that was said to Moshe. What's he coming to emphasize? That the Chiddush of the Torah's Kohanim, that everything was said in Sinai, which again means Midbar Sinai, the area of Sinai, is in regards to the mitzvahs that were said to Moshe and Arvei Smoyev, and therefore Rashi is adding those words Shenidbar LeMoshe. In other words, we're speaking about the mitzvahs that were spoken only to Moshe. We're not speaking about that which was said to the Yidden, because what Moshe Rabbeinu said in Mishnah Torah to the Yidden, that was on his own that he repeated everything. As the pasuk says, Asher Diber Moshe Kol Yisrael in Arvei Smoyev. Says the Rebbe, according to all of this, that with his Pirush, which is according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, will fit both according to Rabbi Akiva as well as according to Rabbi Yishmael. And Rashi is basically trying to show us that the Torah's Kohanim could even be understood according to Rabbi Yishmael, which is that the general idea was said on Har Sinai, and the details were given in Oil Moed, according to Rashi. This could fit with Rabbi Shmuel as well, because Sinai, as we said, could really just include the whole general area. We're going to understand even more why Rashi uses those words, Kach Shnuya b'Torah's Kohanim. This is what it says in Torah's Kohanim, and to me it appears that this is the Pirush. Why does Rashi say this? It says the Rebbe, the Gemara tells us a klal rule. Stam Sifra is the Torah's Kohanim. Sifra generally is said by Rabbi Yehuda. And then it mentions some other medrashim, and then it concludes V'kulu, and all of these medrashim, al libad Rabbi Akiva, all follow the view of Rabbi Akiva. The question is, if clearly the Gemara tells us Torah's Kohanim follows the view of Rabbi Akiva, how can we even come along and try to explain the Torah's Kohanim like Rabbi Yishmael, which is arguing with Rabbi Akiva? And this is what Rashi is saying. Kach shnuya b'Torah's Kohanim. This is what it says in Torah's Kohanim. V'nirli shekach pirush. And to me, it seems that this is the meaning. Meaning to say, in Torah's Kohanim itself, the way we would understand the Torah's Kohanim on its own would be like Rabbi Akiva. But over here in Pshuta Shel Mikra, which is Rashi's inyan, here we specifically want to follow also the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And as the Rebbe goes further and says that perhaps Rashi wants to learn specifically as Rabbi Yishmael and not like Rabbi Akiva. That is, the details were given in Oil Moed, And when it says, and therefore when Rashi says Sinai instead of Har Sinai, he's actually coming to negate the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, that it's just given in the general region of Sinai, but it's in the Oil Moed, actually fits more with Derech HaPshat, which is Rashi's way in Torah. Why is that? Says there are 2 points. Number one, according to Limud al Derech HaPshat, it makes sense to say that the details of mitzvahs are being said to the Yidden there and only there where the Torah mentions it. And since in the Torah it does not mention that all the details of the mitzvahs were given on Har Sinai, so we would have to have some way of forcing us in Derech HaPshat to have to say that. And therefore Rashi learns that what the Torah's Kohanim is telling us, that everything is given from Sinai, it's first of all, it's only speaking about, or whatever is said later in Arvi Smoyev, make sure to realize that it was said already earlier. And also that it doesn't have to be at Har Sinai, it's Midbar Sinai, the general area of Sinai. The Rebbe actually says over here in the brackets that according to this way of understanding Rabbi Yishmael, will also automatically understand the question that Tosfos asks. An answer to something that Tosfos asks on the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, Klalus upratos, all the general ideas and the details were said in Sinai, repeated again in the Oil Moed, and a third time in Arvi Smoyev. Tosfos asks, why are we discussing suddenly the third time Arvi Smoyev? Rabbi Shmuel was never even speaking about Arvi Smoyev. Rabbi Shmuel said that we spoke the general ideas in Har Sinai, the details in the Oil Moed. Why is Rabbi Akiva suddenly adding about this third point of Arvi Smoyev, which wasn't even part of Rabbi Shmuel's discussion? So Tosfos answered that it needed to be mentioned about Arvi Smoyev because of a further discussion in the Gemara, which that's why this needed to be mentioned, but not that it's relevant to this actual machlokes itself. But the Rebbe says that actually the way we're learning, it is relevant to the machlokes itself. When Rabbi Akiva says that they were repeated a third time in Arvi Smoyev, according to Rabbi Shmuel, not necessarily so. Because as we said before, according to Rabbi Shmuel, only that which is says specifically in the Torah do we know that that's where it was and when it was. According to Rabbi Shmuel, just like he holds that the details were not said in Har Sinai because it doesn't say so in the Torah, so it was only said later in Oil Moed, so too he wouldn't necessarily agree that everything was repeated in Arvi Smoyev if the Torah doesn't say so. A further point, and a more important point, says the Rebbe, the general idea of Shemitah was actually said already earlier in Parshas Mishpatim, even before the Tzivui HaMishkan, even before commanding of the Mishkan. The Pasuk said already, Sheishanim Tizra Goymer Vashmi is Tishmatena Goymer. In our Parsha, when, in other words, when there's, in the Oil Moed, there was the details given. But the general idea was said already earlier. So here we see a clear thing again, this idea that the klolus, like Rabbi Yishmael says, the general idea was given earlier by Har Sinai, and the details are now being given in Oil Moed, which is exactly what's happening by the mitzvah of Shemitah. Says the Rebbe in Sif Yud, even though according to Pshut Shul Mikra, fits actually more with the words of Rabbi Yishmael, but al derech ha'alacha, the din is actually according to Rabbi Akiva. As the rule is, halacha k'Rabbi Akiva mechavere, when Rabbi Akiva is arguing with one of his colleagues, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first prefacing the explanation of the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael al pi pinim yisoyin yanim. The Rebbe says the difference between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, as discussed other times, many times already. Rabbi Yishmael was a kohen gadol, and his avodah wasn't in a way of, as the pasuk says, completely separated kodesh kadoshim. That's the avodah of a kohen and a kohen gadol. This is the avodah of tzaddikim. On the other hand, Rabbi Akiva was a ben geirim. His avodah was more in the style of the avodah of a bal tshuva. This is actually what Rabbi Akiva also says, Kol Yomai, my whole life, mitztayr, I was bitzar, I was distressed, I was hoping, when am I already going to have the opportunity to have the mitzvah of Mesiras Nefesh? He was standing in this mode of Mesiras Nefesh his whole life, not only when he's saying Shema, when he's saying Echad, but his whole life is Mesiras Nefesh. The Rebbe explains. From the perspective of Avodas HaTzadikim, you need to have Mesiras Nefesh, but it's only in the beginning of the day, when you're saying Shema. But the rest of the day, you're acting in an orderly fashion. You have the impression of the Mesiras Nefesh in all of your Torah and mitzvahs, but what are you involved in? Regular Seder of Torah and mitzvahs. But from the perspective of Avodas HaTshuva, which Tshuva is higher than limitations, we are constantly standing. Whether it's when you're learning Torah, whether it's when you're doing mitzvahs, even when you're involved in mundane things, you're always standing in that mode of Mesiras Nefesh. And that's what means Kol Yomai. In every single aspect, he was standing in a movement of Mesiras Nefesh. Says the Rebbe, this is then the reason for the machlokes that Rabbi Yishmael says that all the general ideas were given at Sinai and the details on Oil Moed. And Rabbi Akiva says no, the general ideas and the details are at Sinai. What's the machlokas? Says the Rebbe, let's understand the difference between Sinai and oil moed. Oil moed has a certain order. There's mechitzas, there's certain parts of the oil moed. There's the ureas, there's the crushing. It says in Sfarim that it had the same shape and form as the whole Seder Shtashlos, as the Ramah explains in the Sefer called Torah Sa'olah, which represents generally an avoid of Seder V'Adrag in orderly fashion. Yes, it's true that the Mishkan also had the avoid of Ktoiras, the once a year when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but that's once a year. That's similar to the Mesiras Nefesh of once a day at the time of Kriya Shema. Also, who goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Only the Kohen Gadol. Yes, it's true. It's on behalf of all the Yid and Shluch HaShalom Kamoisai, like every single Yid has a Kohen Gadol inside of him, but again, it's something very unique. So that's all the avoida of the Oyel Moyed, Seder V'Adraga. What does Sinai represent? Sinai is a midbar. It's not a place of being settled and organized and so on. This is an avodah that goes beyond limitations, beyond all the orders of the world. And this is what we find by Sinai. What happens when the Eibishter says the Aseret HaDibros, for each one of the Dibros, Yatsan, Neshmasan, and Neshmasan are going out. The Neshamis are going out. Seemingly, you'll say, I understand, on Noichi and Lo Yiyelecha, the Isra of Avodah Zarah, this is something to do with Mesiras Nefesh. One has to be killed and not allow himself to do the Aveira. But when we're speaking about the idea of Kabidas Avicha, honoring your parents, and Lo Yisignev, not to steal, etc., these are mitzvahs sichlius, rational mitzvahs, avodah shal pitam v'das. What does this have to do with the neshamas leaving their bodies? Says the Rebbe, yes, but this is the whole idea of Sinai. Sinai represents a midbar of Kedusha, a place that's higher than order. And therefore, on every single one of the words of our Sinai, there was Mesiras Nefesh. Similar to what we said about Rabbi Akiva, Kol Yom, my whole life I was standing in a mode of Mesiras Nefesh. Says the Rebbe, this is then the machloikes between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. As far as the avoid of tzaddikim is concerned, Rabbi Yishmael, it's enough that the general idea is Mesinai. Meaning to say that when we are speaking about mitzvahs in a general way, even every single mitzvah individually, but the general idea of the mitzvah, the foundation of the mitzvah is Sinai, meaning Mesiras Nefesh. But when we come into the details, fulfilling the mitzvah with all of its details, here we have to go in an organized way, and that's what Rabbi Shmuel says the mitzvahs are in Oyel Moyed. The details are in Oyel Moyed, not in a Sinai type of style, in a Mesudadika type of style. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, which is the avoid of Tshuva, says that because we are dealing with things in the world that we need to convert, that we need to transform. Rabbi Akiva is Ben Gerim. So we need to have the need of Mesiras Nefesh even when we're dealing with the details. And furthermore, because we are in this mode of tshuva that's higher than Seder, that's what enables us that even in the details we could have this avoid of Mesiras Nefesh. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why in Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rashi is saying that we follow Rabbi Yishmael, and nevertheless, the way the Rebbe explained that it could follow more Rabbi Yishmael, whereas according to Halacha, we still follow Rabbi Akiva. That is, Mitzad, the union of Torah, Matan Torah, coming from the way things are above, and Torah looks at the Yidden. Torah ala roiv tadaber. That is v'amich kulam tzaddikim. We look at the general idea of how Yidden are tzaddikim. So we say klolei sel misinai. The general idea is ar misinai. Again, meaning the foundation of mitzvahs need the mesiras nefesh, but the mitzvah itself is done in an organized way. But mitzad halacha. Halacha from the word halicha yisoylam, that's already the way Torah is dealing with the world. We have to deal with a gashmi world, with gashmi things, and certainly in the time of Golus, when there are so many concealments. So we have to have the strength and the avodah of birurim, the idea of a tshuva, and therefore the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, that even the details need to be from Sinai, meaning that in every single aspect needs to be permeated and be standing in this particular mode of Mesiras Nefesh.